Hello, this is Alison, welcoming you back to the Gardening by Design box of tricks, where we're talking about choosing plants to suit the conditions in your garden. Part 3. Sun, shade and cold spots. In the previous video, I talked about the science of things in the soil that you can't see. Well, the requirements that we're looking at in this last part are much more visible. Basically, the above ground part of your garden, dependent on the situation. We're looking at plants' needs for light and warmth. The other difference from part 2 is that light and warmth can vary significantly from the front garden to the back and from border to border. The good thing about this is that you get to grow a wider range of plants with differing needs. Let's start with light. All green plants photosynthesize light energy into the usable sugar glucose, and plants out in the garden rely on sunlight. So you might reasonably think that the more sunlight a plant receives, the better it will grow. But pause for a moment to think of the different natural environments where plants have evolved, and you will see that there are many plants adapted to shady conditions, and they will struggle in the full glare of the midday sun. Yes, even in the UK. But shade has a poor reputation, so we need to break it down into a few separate boxes. Some borders, the south-facing ones if you're in the northern hemisphere, and any island beds in the middle of a largish lawn, for example, will receive the full amount of sunshine, with nothing to block it out from sunrise to sunset. At the other end of the scale are those genuinely difficult spots, of dense shade under trees or permanently shaded between a high fence and the house. In between are the beds that will see sunlight for part of the day and lose it behind hedges or trees for the rest, and borders that receive sunshine but filtered through trellis or the canopy of a light tree such as a silver birch. The final box that I like to think of are those areas that receive little or no direct sun but are not overshadowed by trees or the like, and the effect is as if the sky has covered in cloud. The plant choices for the middle situations are largely interchangeable, but splitting them out gives me the chance to share a few more plants, which is always nice. We saw some plants that like very dry soil in part 2, and frequently these are also sun lovers. But where you have full sun and a good moisture-retentive soil, then there is a huge range of plants. This is the ideal situation for a traditional cottage garden or herbaceous border perennials, and favourites like roses, although of course you don't have to plant them in a strictly traditional style. Sunshine suits plants that are pollinated by insects, and often these use colour and scent of the flowers to attract them. Here I've highlighted goldenrod, that is a great flower for small insects, and border phlox, both hardy perennials. For large structural shrubs you could plant buddleia, sometimes called the butterfly bush with good reason, and Lacestaria that attracts bees. As we move on to shadier areas, we get to the plants that do not thrive in wall-to-wall sunshine. This includes plants that have evolved in woodland, whether native deciduous woodland like this bluebell wood, or Himalayan forests. Also, some varieties, particularly shrubs, have been selected to have yellow foliage, and they're prone to scorching in full sun. These are also better in partial or dappled shade. The Mexican orange blossom, Choisya tonata, is a striking evergreen shrub. The fragrance comes from the foliage, and the form sundance has yellower leaves, and is one that needs a light spot without full sun. In dense shade the leaves revert to green, and in midday sun it's likely to bleach. For hardy perennials, penstemon will produce flowers all summer long, in sun or mild shade. And Japanese anemones add colour in late summer through to October. It's useful to have ground cover to fill in between plants and discourage the weeds. And the variegated periwinkle will ramble through all but dense shade. Partially shaded areas receive roughly half a day of sun either morning or afternoon, and the rest of the time it's blocked out. This still allows a fair selection of flowering plants to succeed. Dappled shade usually occurs close to or underneath deciduous trees with a very open canopy. I have already mentioned the silver birch, as this is a good popular garden tree and it gives the right impression of shade. Hellebores are one of the earliest flowering perennials and love a rich soil in partial shade. Begonias are tolerant of a wide range of situations, including full sun, but equally happy and very useful in a shady spot, even if the soil's quite dry. Heuchera have the advantage of coloured foliage all year long and prefer to be out of the midday sun or planted below taller shrubs. In the shrub category, rhododendrons, azaleas and camellias all thrive and flower well in light shade. By the way, not all plants for shadier spaces have purple flowers, but you do start to lose the yellows and oranges as the light levels drop. And finally, let's look at dense shade. Hardy geraniums will grow in full shade and provide a mound of foliage, but you will have fewer flowers as the shade level increases. The spreading dead nettle, Lamia maculatum, will fill gaps and suppress weeds, although itself can become a bit too vigorous if grown in better conditions. Ferns do not produce flowers at all to reproduce, and there are species for damp or dry soil, and they all give a luxurious effect. And Aucuba is one of the few varieties of variegated shrubs that does not revert to plain green if the leaves are in the shade. Most plants will compensate for the lack of sunlight by producing more chlorophyll, effectively greening up any yellow or cream areas, but Aucuba keeps its bright yellow splashes whatever. So you can see that shade is not necessarily a problem in the garden, as long as you choose the right plants. And next we'll move on to the final section of this topic, warmth, or more to the point, cold. Of course, there is a place for annual and tender plants in a garden, but I expect that for the most part you want to plant something out into the ground and enjoy it for many years. I have talked already about plants that like dry soil and full sun, usually coming from warmer climes than our temperate UK. And certainly here, the questions to ask are, can I supply enough warmth for a long enough period in the summer for the plant to produce leaves, flowers, fruit, or whatever? And secondly, is my garden simply too cold for a particular plant to survive the winter? For those plants that need a long, hot summer, you are looking for a sheltered position, out of the wind and catching the sun all day. A south-facing border against the wall of a house like this one is usually the warmest spot, as the wall reflects the warmth of the sun back onto the plants and acts as a storage heater, keeping the nighttime temperatures up too. This will become a prized location for borderline hardy plants, as warmth from the house will help in cold winters too. In this case, for a potted olive tree and a fan-trained apricot. Exactly what you can get away with in your warmest spot will obviously vary hugely depending on where you live. But in the southeast of England, you could consider agapanthus. These large bulbs need to be a bit under stress or pot-bound to produce a good show of flowers. Astelia doesn't flower, but it's evergreen with a real sheen to the silvery leaves. There are several woody salvias with red or pink flowers that can be left to grow into a shrub or cut back for new growth each year. And the star jasmine, Trachelospermum, has fragrant white star-shaped flowers in summer. It's not as hardy nor as vigorous as the more widely known summer jasmine, but it won't get out of control and is a great evergreen climber. So on from how much warmth you can supply in summer to how much plants will survive the winter. There are plenty of plants hardy down to -25 or even -35 degrees centigrade. But as we saw in part 1, hardiness varies based largely on where the plant originates. And so you need to know just how low temperatures regularly drop in your own area. But there are also so many lovely plants that are less hardy. The ones that might just survive a mild winter but succumb to the occasional big freeze. You can make a sensible choice on these borderline plants by identifying the coldest and warmest parts of your garden to put them in, and by encouraging more robust growth or providing some protection if things get extreme. And you can help your borderline plants make it through the cold weather by not being too kind to them in summer. There is evidence that growing plants with less water helps hardiness Obviously, you're not going to kill them from drought, but if you water more sparingly, the plants cannot develop the lush, soft leaves in late summer that are much more likely to be frost damaged. Come the winter, the harder, woodier growth will be more frost resistant. But you will still be looking for the warmest spots in your garden in winter, and generally these are the same as provide heat and shelter in summer. However, there is one more weather phenomenon to be wary of: the frost pocket. These form because cold air is heavier than warm air, it sinks to the ground and flows downhill. A frost pocket occurs when cold air collects and cannot escape, making the ground colder than the area around and more prone to frost. There are two primary locations where this happens: in a natural dip in the ground that can explain an isolated patch of frost on an otherwise green lawn, or more tricky locations where the air is stopped by a wall or fence at the bottom of a slope. This is tricky because often it might seem that this is a particularly sheltered spot in the garden, and you are tempted to put slightly tender plants there for protection. In fact, this is probably the worst place. And it is not only the cold that can harm plants in winter. Many plants that are tough enough to survive those -25-degree temperatures, or sit under snow for months in winter, are expecting the conditions to be cold, but pretty dry. The problem for these plants is the wet, and a typical wet UK winter with rainfall rather than fluffy snow can cause the crown and the roots to rot while the plant is dormant. We know that plants from mountains like the Alps survive very low temperatures, but they need free draining dry soil, and this is just as true in winter. Planting in small pockets of soil amongst rocks ensures good drainage around the base of the plant and the roots. Alternatively, grow in pots and move them indoors into cold frames or greenhouses for protection from the rain rather than the cold. Plants outside in pots can be moved to the shelter of the house, but need a quick check in autumn to make sure that the drainage holes are not blocked, and it's a good idea also to raise the pots up a bit to ensure that the winter rains drains freely out of the bottom. Firstly, because the roots need air as well as water, and secondly, because soil in a pot is much more likely to freeze with the cold air around it than soil below the ground. And a pot full of water means a solid block of ice around the roots, and that has to be bad news. And finally, you can protect plants physically from the cold in situ, but this is realistically only going to take a few degrees of frost off. For example, putting cloches over plants, or wrapping with fleece, as this fan-trained apricot. It flowers in February, so the blossom needs fleecing on frosty nights. And here we are at the end of the final section with a recap of caring for plants that need maximum warmth. Firstly, check the usual lowest temperatures in winter for your locality to decide which plants have a hope of surviving. And identified sheltered spots for plants from rather warmer climates, for summer and winter. And to grow plants a little bit harder with less water, particularly in late summer, to help make them more frost resistant. Keep winter rains off plants that tolerate the cold but hate the wet and are more likely to rot as they're dormant in winter. And finally, you may need to be ready with temporary protection to nip outside if a hard frost is forecast. Overall in this video, I have explained that while plants require light and warmth, gardeners need to consider the other side of the coin, namely shade and minimum temperature. We have seen that shade is a sliding scale, not black and white either or, and there are plants adapted for every degree of shade, although as the light levels diminish, you have to find more interest in foliage and texture than bright flowers. When it comes to temperature, small changes in the orientation and exposure across the garden can create different microclimates, and you need to match these to the hardiness of the plants you want to grow. with the ability to push the boundaries by adding extra protection on cold nights. Back at the start of this topic, I said that the key to understanding which plants will thrive in any particular spot in your garden is to understand two things: what plants need to grow and what you are offering. And now that you know how to identify these characteristics and match them up, you are all set to be even more successful in your plant choices. Through the right plant, right place topic, we have seen how plants have 4 key requirements for growth: water, nutrients, light and warmth, and how the availability of these can vary from garden to garden and border to border because of the soil and the situation. And finally, we have come full circle to see that looking at similar natural habitats is a useful guide to what we can expect to grow successfully in our gardens. There's more information about how the Gardening by Design box of tricks can help you to plan, plant and look after your plot on the Gardening by Design website. I hope to see you again on another topic soon. Happy gardening!